Welcome to Food, Wine, and Whiskey, a podcast about having fun conversations on tasty dishes, vinos, and spirits from around the world. Rob is your host. He is an avid home chef, WSET Level 2 award in wine, and a whiskey drinker and collector. Time to set the table. Here's Rob.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. We appreciate you being here. And as you can see by the title of this episode, we're going to be talking all about the wines and the area, the culture, the history of Alsace, France. And my guest today, who is the expert, the man with all the knowledge of this area, is Kevin Day, editor-in-chief of openingabottle.com. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rob. You're setting me up a little bit there with my level of expertise. I'm totally in love with Alsace, but it's one of those places that is so complex and interesting that you just feel like, boy, you're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, and you know it'll take several decades before you feel like you've even gotten past that level. So, looking forward to talking to you about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get started on that, though, I mentioned just quickly there, openingabottle.com. I want you to share with the folks, what this is, kind of what's the content they can get. What are some of the other things besides the content that's available that they can get from your website?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. Opening a Bottle it started as a wine blog in 2014, and I just kept pulling on that thread and getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the world of wine, and really committed myself to making it more of a publication than a blog. And I think, the real difference there is as much as I can not make it about, me and more about what I'm reporting on, the more sophisticated the content kind of became. So it's a lot of wine education articles, individual stories about vineyards and producers and their family history. It's really concentrated on France and Italy. Those are the two areas I know best. And have been certified in through the Wine Scholar Guild program. So my level of expertise, both from a practical standpoint, book smart standpoint, is in France and Italy, but also those are places that I've traveled to extensively, including Alsace. And so a lot of that is conveyed in Opening a Bottle. And along the way, I take my camera with me because I'm an avid photographer. So a lot of the content is complemented by my imagery, which makes it a little bit different in the wine world. I also do wine reviews. And I do wine education classes. I'm doing one this weekend for my subscribers on Barolo and Barbaresco, which is going to be a lot of fun. That's going to be Sunday night. And each one of those classes has a recording. So people who subscribe to my site and who help, which really funds it and keeps the lights on, those subscribers have some perks. And one of them is they can watch any of my wine classes as videos down the road. There's also wine reviews, as I mentioned, as well as kind of a curated list of the best producers. All that's behind a paywall. But it's really fun. I love editorial work. I've always been kind of in the publishing space. And so having my own publication and managing the editorial is just really a lot of fun. And I put a lot of passion into it.
Yeah. And I want to tell everybody, go check it out. All the things that you said. And by the way, Kevin, you also mentioned there that you're an expert in the world of Italian and French wines, so I'm just saying.
I guess it did.
But I want to mention to everybody that, all the things that you said, but you do a lot of other cool things. And I don't want to give it all away. I want people to go check it out, that really make it easier for the wine consumer to kind of understand and kind of consume the content that you're putting out. And I don't want to get into all of it, but, there's some things that you do that I think are very unique and very, very helpful to us who are trying to explore the world of wine and understand it a little bit better. I think you do a really good job of that. So definitely go check out the website.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Rob. In the end, like, wine is fun, right?
Absolutely.
So if you're taking time out of your day to actually read about wine, I hope it would be fun, and so I don't do market research to see what, how to make content fun. If it's fun for me, I hope it'll be fun for somebody out there. So sometimes I write in ways that are maybe a little unconventional, and my tasting notes if they're always kind of focused on, what would a wine beginner like in this wine? And then on top of that, what would an obsessive like about this wine? And if I can't answer those two questions, I don't write about the wine. So the wines that I write about are really good. They're really interesting. And they should be interesting, not just for wine geeks. That's the point. And I think that's kind of starting to resonate. We're getting some really good momentum on the site. We're having some special guests join for wine classes. hoping to have some more contributors in the future. And hopefully we'll expand coverage more into Austria this upcoming year. That's an area that I'm really passionate about in my free time. So yeah, all good things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we dive into the substance of this episode, I'd like you to just give a shout out, a big thank you to the folks who provided these wines. We're going to talk about Alsace, but we also have 3 bottles that we get to go through and sip on a little bit.
Right. And I think that's a good thing to do real quick before we move on here. You and I were talking about what we could do next. We did our first podcast and we're kind of like, well, we should do a second podcast. What would be a good topic? And Alsace came to mind for me. And when we kind of hit upon that topic, we reached out to Wines of Alsace, which is the consortium that represents the growers of the area, their American press representatives, and said, is there a way that you could help arrange some wines that we're both tasting simultaneously? You're in Texas, I'm in Colorado. We don't necessarily have the same wines on the market. And one thing that you'll notice with Alsace is just go to one of these producers and their importer's website. They'll have 40 wines that this one winery is making. So you may be able to find, Meyer Fonet in Texas, and I might be able to find them in Colorado. Good luck finding the exact wine that we have. And so the folks at Wines of Alsace were really great about being able to arrange that. And so you and I have exactly the same wines. So later on, as we're talking about these, we'll be able to, be sharing notes on the exact same wine, which is pretty cool.
Well, let's start by talking about Alsace and visiting there. You've traveled there, as you said, multiple times. Just talk about what it's like. What did you experience? What was maybe unexpected about that area in France than, other parts of France as a wine region and just as a community and a culture that's there?
Sure. I think the first thing to know about Alsace is where it is in France, because that really drives home its uniqueness. It's located in eastern France, right on the border with Germany. It's in the Rhine River Valley, actually. And it's on one side, it's hemmed in by the Vosges Mountains, which are to the west. And the Vosges Mountains they're not the Alps, they're nothing huge, but they're significant enough that they create a unique microclimate for wine growing. But they also kind of serve as a cultural border as well, in an interesting way that separates Alsace from the rest of France. One thing that the Vosges Mountains do is that they block a lot of maritime influences off the North Atlantic. So you're not getting those influences we talk about in Champagne and Chablis. You're really in a fully continental climate. And on the other side of things, facing Germany, this area is not quite German either. It has some similarities. We'll dive into that in a little bit more detail later. There's certainly an intertwined history that's important to understand. And you certainly see some traits of the Alsatian wine industry that are more closely similar to German wine industry than the French wine industry, and vice versa. So it's kind of this hodgepodge, which is really interesting. Going there, for one thing, it is one of the top wine destinations to visit. Bar none.
Okay, I want to ask that though, because when people think about a trip to France, even folks I know who have been into wine, Alsace doesn't come up a lot. They always talk about going through Chablis and Champagne and down Bordeaux and Burgundy and, down through the Rhone Valley. But, is it something that I'm not aware of, or is this really a destination for tourism in the wine world?
Well, it's prettier than those regions. I mean, I'll just come out and say it. I mean, the hillsides, there's just so many different postcard perfect villages and vineyards. And the city of Colmar, which is right, kind of the epicenter of the wine industry, which is south of Strasbourg. Both Colmar and Strasbourg are great tourism destinations, and they do get significant tourist attention. And I think what makes it such a great destination for visiting from a wine standpoint is you're exposed to wines there that you just won't find in our market in America. And that, for someone who's really into wine, is pretty exciting. And I'm mainly referring to things like, a sweet wine made from Gewürztraminer, which you just would never see here. And it's paired with the local cuisine in a way that it makes perfect sense. That's the kind of thing you just can't duplicate at home, in our kitchens with a wine that, we bought at our local wine shop. On top of that, it's a very friendly destination. I mean, to me, it's one of the friendliest places I've visited in France, if not the friendliest. And so there's kind of a welcoming feel to Alsace that I think could resonate with anyone, whether you're just barely into wine or whether you're really, WSET level 3, and looking to advance your, to the diploma level. I mean, you're going to find something in Alsace that's very interesting. I think I was based in Colmar for the travels that I did, and Colmar is a stunning little city. It's known as Little Venice because it has canals running through it. It's not nearly as dependent on canals as Venice, so it's not in a lagoon or anything like that. But it does have this charming kind of feel where people are, tourists are going by in little boats in the canals, and the half timbered houses are very colorful, and it's just a very, atmospheric place with a lot of geraniums blooming in baskets and fountains everywhere. It's very charming, and it wasn't really hammered by World War II like a lot of the outlying villages were. This was obviously a battlefront during World War II, but fortunately, a lot of Colmar's interior was kind of well preserved, which makes it a nice place to stay. And just, when you get out into the vineyards and into the hills, it's very verdant. It's very green. Even though this is one of the driest places in France, it does not look like that. It's very sunny and warm. It's a great place for cycling if you're a cyclist and you want to do some cycle touring. And just all these things kind of combine to just make it, a really intriguing place to go visit. Yeah, go ahead.
What about size? How big an area is this? Do you go east, west, north, south? I mean, kind of what's the...
It follows the Vosges Mountains, and it's a long chain of mountains. I have to look it up in terms of how long this chain is, but it's a pretty big area. I think if you were to drive from the northern edge in Strasbourg, so Strasbourg is the northern limit of the wine growing area, and Colmar is smack dab in the middle of it. I think they're probably about maybe an hour 15 to an hour and a half drive apart from each other. Yep. And then to the south, I think it's another hour to the southern limits to the city of Thann, where the Rangon de Thann Grand Cru vineyard is. Maybe a little bit more than an hour. So, I mean, to drive the length of Alsace takes some time. It's a big area, but it's a narrow strip of land. It's not, like Champagne is a very broad, enormous kind of, it's as wide as it is long. Alsace is very narrow and right up, kind of snug up against the German border there. When I went there, for me, I mean, living in Denver, I have a direct flight to Frankfurt. So it's real convenient to fly to Frankfurt and then take the train backwards into France to Strasbourg. And, you're there in, about hour and a half from the Frankfurt airport, you're in Alsace.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a good tip to get.
Yeah. You don't have to go through Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah. Kevin, one of the things when I asked the question about it being kind of this tourist location was because when you think about the white wines of France, you don't really, at least not on the top of the list or the top few, Alsace isn't mentioned. But I think, as I've explored and gotten into this region, the wines that are made here are stunning. I mean, I have really enjoyed what I've had from this area, and they're not, some people might hear Riesling, they may hear Pinot Gris, but it's different in this region than the expressions of these wines I've had in other places.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that, because I think there's a lot of confusion about Alsace on the market that, we may as well just get out of the way. I mean, I think this is partly why we don't hear a whole lot of talk in the United States about Alsace. Within France, it's very highly regarded, and a lot of the wines that are sold within are just sold domestically in Alsace, and then also they have a very strong presence in Germany and a lot of the neighboring countries around there. But as it relates to Alsace and to why the United States market is maybe a little bit of a trickier proposition, there's a few factors to that. And I think some of it starts with the bottle, to be honest. We have this bottle shape that they make their wines in, which I think a lot of people still have kind of a preconceived idea that this is a sweet wine just because of the shape of the bottle, which is misleading. It's not true. I mean, obviously, the shape of a bottle does determine, we're familiar with Bordeaux and Burgundy bottles. You'll have one will be Cabernet, one will be Pinot Noir. So there is something you can tell about the shape of a bottle. But in the case of, this bottle, which is known as the Hock bottle, it's a traditional bottle that was used because it was really saved on space. They could pack it in tightly, ship it on boats, and it was durable enough that it could survive the journey. They didn't need to put a punt in the bottom of the bottle because the passage on rivers was smooth enough. It wasn't going over bumpy roads where the bottles might break. So it has a history. It's traditional, and they're proud of that bottle. But it's also, it's kind of created, people associate it with German wines. And then they have this association with German wines being sweet, which is not always the case. There's plenty of great German dry wines. In fact, they're getting drier and drier with each vintage. So that's one little misconception, I think, that holds back the availability of Alsatian wines in America for us. I think another thing is these tall bottles, they're a little bit hard to fit in the refrigerator. If I've got a pet peeve about them, it's, I'm the type of guy who likes to put a cork into a wine and taste it the next night. I don't like to drink a whole lot, or just go through a whole bottle in one night. I kind of want to see how it evolves. And boy, you take this tall bottle and then you put a cork in it, and the cork is sticking out a little bit. You can't get it to fit on the milk shelf, on your refrigerator for the next night. And then on top of that, in a wine refrigerator, they're usually the bottles that have to be kind of just jimmied into place so that the door actually closes. So, there's none of that has anything to do with the quality of the wine. None of it does. But I do think people see that bottle right away and their mind goes to maybe it not being like a Chablis or being on the same level of quality as some of these other things, which is unfortunate because these wines really are of high quality. I think the other thing too is, we may as well get, another elephant in the room addressed, which is the grape varieties that they use. Riesling, Pinot Gris, Gewürztraminer. And I think people think Riesling, they think sweet again. There's a lot of people who just, they can't get into Riesling for whatever reason. Some of that is they're not exposed to higher quality Riesling. Some of it is that they had a sweet Riesling years ago and they just didn't want to come back to that experience. Some people associate it with the petroleum jelly Vaseline aroma that you sometimes get with an older Riesling, particularly like a German Riesling. These Alsatian Rieslings tend to not have that note. It can show up a little bit, but so there's a little bit of like I don't want to call it a stigma about Riesling, but it's not the same as Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay in terms of people just really enthusiastically embracing it. And then Pinot Gris, same grape as Pinot Grigio. And we know there's always kind of a battle with Pinot Grigio because people think of, a lot of those Northern Italian Pinot Grigios that are just very light and flimsy and unsubstantial. And I tell you, Pinot Gris from Alsace is anything but that. This is the place for Pinot Gris in the world. Really the top terroir. Because of the richness that you can get, the complexity. It's really a stellar grape, but it's also this version of Pinot Gris is not familiar to people. And so it may not be an immediately obvious pairing or to a context or to an occasion. And then last, Gewürztraminer. This is kind of the third big grape in Alsace. And that's a divisive grape. It's one of the most assertive grape varieties in terms of flavor, in terms of its profile. It can be very high in alcohol. It can be kind of rich. It can be spicy. It can be floral. It can taste like you're, eating a bag of potpourri, in some cases. So some people are just kind of turned off by the grape varieties from the start, unfortunately. And this being one of the only places in France where they do varietal labeling, the varietal's screaming at you when you buy the bottle. So, those are some of the reasons why I think maybe the impression of Alsace in America isn't really up to what we see when we visit Alsace and we taste some of the really great wines from there. Or when we encounter one of the great wines here in America, it just all depends. It's a little bit of, there's just a little bit of education that people need about Alsace and what this place has to offer and how to navigate these wines.
Let me ask you this. Is it a little bit with distribution as well? I think about a couple of brands that I see almost everywhere as far as in a big box wine store, something like that. But I don't see a lot of variety or different producers when it comes to Alsace. And so it's kind of that chicken and the egg, right?
It's a vicious cycle for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've talked to importers before and said, boy, I love this producer here, but they're just not imported. You guys should go chase them. And they go, yeah, it's just so hard with Alsace. They kind of already, they're going straight to, how do I get this client to put Alsatian wine on their menu? Because then their somms have to then sell it at the table. Or how do I get it? Is it going to move on the shelf? So honestly, what we're drinking first here, a Cremant d'Alsace, is often a starting point for importers. They'll bring in a Cremant d'Alsace because it doesn't have this, it just plays by its own rules. It's a sparkling wine. It's Cremant d'Alsace. Well, what's that? That gets people a little bit more curious right away, and they can kind of test the waters with that in the market.
And for folks who are listening who may not know what a Cremant is, go ahead and tell them what this is.
Yeah, Cremant's a traditional method sparkling wine. So think of a champagne style wine in terms of it's being made with a secondary fermentation occurring in the bottle, but it's using Alsatian grapes. So Pinot Blanc is kind of the lead grape oftentimes, but you'll find some Riesling and some Pinot Gris in there. You'll find some Chardonnay sometimes, and if it's a rosé version, then it's entirely Pinot Noir. So Cremant can be kind of a good stepping stone, kind of a good entry point into Alsatian wine in terms of getting a sense for the level of quality here. So I was kind of talking about some of the negative things, about impressions of Alsace, but I wanted to kind of also say, we do have some good news to kind of spread about it, like some of the reasons why you should pursue Alsace. So even though it may require a little bit of hunting, it's worth the hunt. And here's why. I think part of it is the winemaking heritage here is extremely long. It's not uncommon to come across a winemaker who is not just 5th or 6th generation winemaker. They're 10, 12, even 13th generation winemaker, which is just stunning. So there's kind of in the DNA of Alsatian winemaking is a long history of what works, what doesn't, of understanding and also having really high stakes for preserving that legacy into the future. So the quality is really, really high because of that. And another reason the quality is very high is this is a region that's massively committed to organic and biodynamic viticulture. The vineyards are in really tip-top shape in Alsace, especially the hillsides, especially the Grand Cru vineyards. I think 15% of production is organic or biodynamic, which is pretty high. They've got a climate that can allow them to really go full force into that realm and not have to, treat for things like downy mildew in an emergency. So it's a little bit easier for them in their climate. But the wines that make it to the U.S. market, because they tend to be, the cherry-picked wines that will actually really move, the percentage of those that are organic or biodynamic is much higher. So that's another thing that we can kind of celebrate with Alsatian wines. Moving on with that, there's also just a tremendous amount of variety to the vineyard sites. So if you're interested in terroir and you're in the door with one of these grape varieties, you're going to find so many different versions of that wine from all these other producers. And so it kind of, like with me, I got hooked. I just kind of wanted to taste, the next Grand Cru site, or I wanted to see what this person's version was like. And then on top of that, these wines can be very food friendly. You can really, Riesling is amazing with sushi, with all sorts of other types of, even spicy foods. It can be great if it's a little bit more of a richer style. Not super spicy, but just with a little bit of spice. So, you can work with them quite well. And then on top of that, this is an area that's emerging for Pinot Noir. So, we're looking at a region that is changing before our very eyes in a way that's a little bit more exciting. We're going to have more and more red wines coming from this region because the climate is allowing those red grapes to ripen fully. And when you're interested in French red wine, but Burgundy's costing $100 a bottle or even more, could we be looking at a future where Alsace is kind of filling that void for us? It's totally possible. So there's a lot of good things happening here. And, for me, when it comes down to it, there's just great stories to tell because of all the different wineries. They're so many of them are family oriented. They all have these unique personalities to them. Some of my favorites, Domaine Weinbach, Barmes Boucher, Ostertag, Zindhumbrecht. These are great wineries. And so the more that you kind of pursue their wines and get a chance to like, I've not tried this one from them or this one, or you can kind of see how they handle the different vintages. It's the kind of place that you can really get excited about, I think.
Well, you mentioned red wine, and Pinot Noir is coming. And for me and a lot of folks, they may not have heard that news or knew that's very exciting because, to your point, the way they make wine, the quality of the wines that come from there now in the whites, we can only expect, or the bar is set pretty high, that the reds that they do produce and put on the market are probably, to your point, going to be pretty good as well.
Yeah. You think about that hurdle they have to make in the American market, just in our market. I'm not saying we're I don't want to come across like we're the end all be all of fine wine. But for us, listening to this podcast as Americans looking for these wines on our market, you have to think, okay, for an importer to bring in a Pinot Noir from France that's going to sell well, it's going to have to be priced right. It's going to have a level of quality that meets the expectation of the consumer. And hopefully it's not going to be in a tall, skinny bottle that makes people think it's a sweet wine. So you're going to have to kind of find a way to fill that void. And so the wines that are going to pass that hurdle are going to be these really, great domains who have a legacy with white wines, who maybe even have a legacy with Pinot Noir. So we're going to see more and more of those, I think. And I think we ought to pay attention to them because, it's a grape that everybody, expects to be one of the greatest in the world. And maybe it's not the wines from Alsace. I don't know if they can contend with Grand Cru Burgundy or maybe, they probably won't have the same richness that maybe you would expect from Sonoma or from the Willamette Valley, but they have their own type of thing to say about Pinot Noir that I think is worth listening to.
So are they making Pinot Noir now in the region, and they just, consume it locally
Yeah, I don't know if it's got a history of being of local consumption, but it's certainly something that they're increasing the plantings for. Okay. Within the last 2 years, even, they went ahead and allowed 2 of the Grand Cru vineyards in Alsace to be sanctioned for Pinot Noir. So you can now get 2 different expressions of Grand Cru Pinot Noir from Alsace. So, just a real quick primer, the Alsace has Grand Cru level vineyards. They don't have a Premier Cru, but they have these 51 vineyards that are acknowledged for their unique terroir, which I'll get into in a little bit because there's so much to say about rocks and geology if we really get into it. But these are really special, unique sites. And 2 of them, one is Kirchberg de Bar and the other is the Hengst Grand Cru, have a legacy of Pinot Noir plantings that has proven enough of a track record that they felt okay sanctioning the bottling of Grand Cru vineyard, Grand Cru Pinot Noir. One of them, Hengst, was a vineyard that I've walked through with Albermann, the Domaine Albermann, Maurice from Domaine Albermann, who's really probably the top Pinot Noir producer in Alsace. He really made a name for himself, and it's probably a big reason why Pinot Noir from Alsace is gaining traction is because of some of the good work done by some specific domains, and Albermann is one of them. And when we walk through the Grand Cru Hengst, it's got the nice sun exposure. So, that far north in France, you really need optimal sunlight. It has that. While we're walking around, there was a baby deer that was taking a nap in the vineyard.
Wow.
It was filled with poppies growing everywhere, tall grasses. I mean, it's a Garden of Eden type of Grand Cru vineyard. Beautiful place. And I've not seen a vineyard that looks like that in Burgundy. I mean, I love Burgundy, don't get me wrong, but it was a fascinating world to step into. And at that time, this was in 2018 that I walked through this vineyard with him. It wasn't allowed to call that Pinot Noir a Grand Cru Hengst. So, those names are changing a little bit, but it's certainly something to pay attention to. So, yeah, Pinot Noir it's interesting. I do think, there's some work to be done. I've had some examples of Pinot Noir, recently from the Millésimes d'Alsace event that they host, which, I think they're coming from younger plantings, so they're not nearly as complex as maybe what we're hoping for. But I think there's tremendous potential there.
That's awesome. That's exciting news. So I don't know how long before they hit the market here in the States, but when they do, I'm looking forward to trying a few of those for sure. Yeah.
It's certainly something to look for. So,
okay, we've talked, visiting and kind of, the multi, I don't want to say multi, the dual type of culture that's there with the German influence and the French influence. But, why is that? What's the history of this area? Why does it have this mix of culture from the German and the French?
Yeah, and a third part of that would be the Swiss. So
okay, really?
Because it's downstream from Switzerland. So the Rhine River flows out of Switzerland into Alsace and heads north. And by many accounts, a lot of the Alsatian heritage can trace its roots and lineage back actually to Switzerland, which is pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's it is uniquely its own thing. I will say that. they are loyal to France. They'll root for the French soccer team when they play. And there's a recent history with Germany in World War II that is still pretty painful, I think, for a lot of multi-generational families. But nonetheless, it's that location being right on the Rhine River, being kind of this area. If you're familiar with Italian wine and Italian regions, it's really not that different from Alto Adige or from Friuli, where you have, there's some zones like this in Europe where the borders don't really mean a ton. There's so much of a gray area between cultures, and Alsace is really that. Things have just been blending for so long that it's formed its own unique identity. Viticulture in the area does date back to the Romans. So the first evidence of vines producing for wine goes back to 2 AD. So we're talking very far back. I was reading up on this morning from the Wine Scholar Guild manual, and there was a quote in there that in the 9th century there were documented 160 different villages were producing wine in Alsace. So the industry by the 9th century was large enough that you had wines being produced, kind of across the whole Vosges mountain range. And really it reached a prestige peak in the 1500s. It was really the world's most prestigious wine at that time. It's been a celebrated wine for a long time. It just maybe hasn't had the same kind of track record with America like Champagne has, or like Burgundy or Bordeaux has. But it's a very well-regarded and prestigious wine region that had some very difficult times in the 20th century that it had to recover from, that maybe those other wine regions didn't have nearly as much of a hill to climb, to be quite honest. So, that's kind of, if you fast forward from the 1500s to modern times, you see that Alsace went back and forth between Germany and France several times. I actually had to write this down because I thought it was so interesting. So in the 17th century, Louis XIV annexed it from Germany into France. So that's the 17th century. And then the late 1700s, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars that kind of followed, that really destabilizes the region. And then it's reclaimed by Germany in 1871. And then after World War I, it goes back to France. And then Nazi Germany invades in World War II and occupies it for a duration of World War II. And then it's liberated and it goes back to France again. So Alsace was in a tug of war there for a period of time from 1871 to 1945, where it went back and forth. And the uncertainty that came from that, the trauma that came from that, really formulated, the modern identity of Alsace in many ways. And so after that war, when you had so much of the infrastructure destroyed, and you wanted to rebound with the viticulture of the area, it was natural for them to embrace industrialization by doing so. And I think as a result of that, it built the industry back up, but it really kind of had to pivot back towards fine wines, terroir-centric wines, less industrial wines. And that's been kind of the trajectory of the wine region, is going back into more of a traditional mindset, back towards more of a handcrafted wine scene that's really quite robust at this time. But yeah, it's interesting, when you go to Alsace, Rob, and you tour some of these villages, one village will have just a spectacular church steeple crowning it that is clearly several hundred years old. And then another church will look like it's brand new. The steeple will look brand new. And you come to find out that at the close of World War II, a lot of American bombers targeted the churches and the church steeples because that's where the Nazi snipers were as the American troops advanced to liberate Alsace. And so it was an unfortunate sacrifice to liberate Alsace, was to, the icon of each village was destroyed in many instances. And so, there does appear to be a lot of stories that I've heard from wineries that, my great grandfather, he made it to America and he thanked so-and-so who, liberated, met him in person. And so there's kind of this camaraderie that Alsace has with America that's tied to the end of World War II. That's kind of interesting, that I've just seen flashes of. I'm no expert on it by any means, but it's certainly part of this, the wonderful story and the tapestry of this region's history, that kind of, you can actually visibly see it when you're there, which is kind of interesting.
Well, and you mentioned, the back and forth during the war. It wasn't just that they wanted to gain more land, right? This is a strategic location with the mountains and the river that runs
River, yep.
down. That this was a for military reasons. They wanted this area for access across the border into France and into Germany.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think, and predating that, there was a lot of treasure to be had in having this, this wine region under your belt as an empire, right? I mean, but it's interesting when you look at a wine bottle in Alsace, and I want people who are listening to this podcast, if they go shopping for Alsace and they're intrigued, pay attention to pay attention to the labels on these wine bottles, because they're almost a celebration of this duality in so many different ways. I mean, you have a lot of producers where the first name is French and the last name is Germanic in sounding. You have varietal labeling, which is a trait from German wines, but then you have Grand Cru vineyards, which is a trait from French wine. You have tall bottles for which is obviously a Germanic thing, as we were discussing earlier, but then you also have Cremant, and you have these Pinot Noirs that are coming in Burgundy bottles. And then lastly, just think of the grape varieties that are grown there. Riesling, Gewürztraminer, those are Germanic. Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, those are French. Sylvaner, Germanic. So there's just this real milieu that is just right there on the label looking at us when we shop for these wines that I think is worth appreciating.
Well, I want to also ask, obviously, the name of my podcast, Food, Wine, and Whiskey. So, to me, food and wine, beautiful thing together. And when you think about German and the cuisine from Germany, and you think about France and the cuisine from the French, I'm not sure how those get blended together, but do they do that? Are these kind of a fusion of both of these styles of food that work together in some way?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there's a little bit of there's some shades of Germanic. I mean, when I've been there, the food feels a lot more French.
It does. Okay,
it does,
I'm thinking for Germany. I'm going, bratwurst and sauerkraut and different stuff.
Sure.
And yeah,
I mean, you'll see some potatoes on the menu here and there in various forms. Like the kind of the signature dish there is tarte flambée, which is actually like a pizza. It's kind of a flatbread, kind of cream-based sauce. So there's a lot of different variations of that. It goes great with, all these wines. But yeah, and I'm not sure, to be totally honest, I mean, I've gone on wine trip on, like the nature of my travel through Alsace has been probably not best suited for me to comment on the cuisine, because people have been trying to impress my group that I've been with, because, we're wine writers. And so, it's a lot of extravagant foods that, maybe isn't indicative of the typical Alsatian table. But I think even though that's the cuisine, and even though that may be what pairs locally, I think there's a lot of versatility to these wines that, we can certainly open the door to pairing it with pastas and with, everyday meals that we have. I had a banh mi sandwich last night for dinner. I was at a local event here in my neighborhood with my wife, and they catered in banh mi sandwiches. And I was like, this would be really good with some Alsatian Riesling, So, there's all sorts of things that kind of come to mind that can be kind of, you can get creative with.
Absolutely. Well, you ready to dive into the grapes and the styles and the soils and terroirs of Alsace?
Yeah, sure. I just want to have a little note about soil, because I don't really want to talk too much about it, because I don't think it's super helpful for ordinary consumers who are beginners on the region to try to understand the role of the different soils on the grape varieties. But I do think it's important to at least mention, because one other thing that's really, really special about Alsace is that you can make a case that it's the most geologically complex wine region on Earth. Like it has 13 different geological formations under the Vosges Mountains that show up in different ways. And that's pretty exciting when you start diving into the wines, because you get a lot of different expressions of these grape varieties that are completely dependent on the soil that they come from. However, I want to caution people against trying to buy wines based on soil type. The Alsatian winemakers are so proud of this trait and attribute that I've seen a lot of wines labeled with geological terms. So
really,
like this wine is called granite, and you're like, oh, I'm in the mood for granite tonight. It's maybe not like the most helpful term, because you kind of think, well, what do you expect from a Riesling from granite? However, I do think it's important for people to know that this complex geology plays into the diversity of Alsatian wine. You have a very long mountain range that has diversity because of daylight hours from north to south, because it's such a long region. So that's one attribute. You have a lot of microclimates from these side valleys that come out of the Vosges Mountains. But then there's this plate tectonics equation underneath the surface that just makes it a real Rubik's Cube. And I think if you get into the Grand Cru wines, that's where you're going to start seeing the soil play in a different way. And I think the way that you notice that is on the palate. You're not going to get signatures of aromas nearly as much with soil, but it has to do with the acidity and how quickly it crosses your palate. It has to do with kind of the texture of the wine. It has to do with the finish. And the reason soil is so important in all this is because different soils will tell the roots to do different things. If it's an area that doesn't retain a lot of water, which is the case with the Riesling that we're tasting here in a moment, the roots are going to have to go very, very deep in order to find water. And that makes the vines work harder. And that makes oftentimes the grapes a little bit more expressive and aromatic. Sometimes the acidity is a little bit more sharp, a little bit more acidic, a little bit more kind of quick-footed, as I like to kind of call it. I always like to talk about acidity in momentum terms. So the soil does play an important part of all that. And that's a real important part of Alsatian wine.
You answered my question on soil. That's all I wanted it to be, was just to kind of talk about the importance of the soil and that it is just different, not to necessarily dive into, the granite versus limestone or whatever it might be, but just that it's different throughout the area, and it affects the wine in different ways, to your point.
Yeah. And it's some vineyards will be mostly granite, some will have a lot of shale, some will be sandstone, some will be limestone, some will be clay, and then there's like a whole lot that are like a mix of all of that. And they're from different geologic eras as well. So that's why geologists would codify them as differently. The one that's really interesting, and I love telling these little stories, and this is just kind of a anecdote about, what makes, this region interesting. There's one Grand Cru vineyard that stands out above all the others in terms of being just the weirdest and strangest and most eccentric. And that's the Grand Cru Rangen de Tan, which is way in the south part of Alsace. And it's on volcanic soil. So it's kind of a rarity in Alsace to have volcanic soil. So that's one trait that's unique. But it's also a very, very steep vineyard that is over a river. And that river provides humidity that permeates a certain section of this Grand Cru vineyard to allow for what is really a rarity in the world, which is a volcanic wine with noble rot. And
wow.
Domaine Zind Humbrecht works in this vineyard, and they produce the most incredible Pinot Gris and Riesling from this vineyard that is completely different from one vintage to the next. The Grand Cru Rangen de Tan, and Olivier Humbrecht, if you ever get a chance to talk to him, he's a master of wine, incredibly intelligent winemaker, and he really loves to just let this vineyard tell him how the wine should be made each year. So I've had versions of it that are sweet, and it's the most rockin' sweet wine you've ever had because it has that volcanic tone of acidity, the kind of the smoky quality to it, but it's also a sweet wine because of the noble rot. So you've got the noble rot sauteing kind of thing happening to it. There's just so many of these little stories in Alsace that are just totally fascinating and beguiling. So, soil does play a part in the identity of a lot of these wines, for sure.
Well, let's start. You mentioned it at the top of the show, but the key grapes of this area.
Yes.
Let's start there again.
Sure. Riesling is king. So Riesling would be your top grape for the most part in terms of the availability on the market, for one. That's kind of the showpiece grape in many regards. It's Grand Cru eligible in almost all the Grand Cru, if not all of them. I believe every Grand Cru produces some sort of Riesling. And it really has this longevity to it that makes it such a noble grape variety. To use kind of the old term that's often lumped in with Riesling and some of the other great old varieties. Riesling just has this endurance, this ability to age. It has really excellent structure for a white wine. Unlike Chardonnay, which tends to be kind of a blank canvas for a winemaker, Riesling really likes to assert its personality from the soil, from the terroir. It really is terroir expressive. So it can vary from vintage to vintage depending on the weather conditions. It can vary significantly depending on the soil it comes from. It can vary depending on the vessel that it's fermented in. It could be stainless steel. It could be a large oak foeder. completely different kind of wine. So there's a lot of variety to it. And really, if you compare the Riesling in Alsace to Germany, they tend to be higher in alcohol because they have more sun, more warmth in that area. So the grapes produce more sugar for the fermentation process. They tend to be a little bit richer, I think. And I tend to think, just from my own experience, I don't know if this is empirically true or not, but I've not noticed the petrol note nearly as much with Riesling from Alsace as I have from Germany. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, doesn't mean you won't encounter it, but it tends to not be nearly such a hallmark as you would have from like the Mosel. Second grape to mention would be Pinot Gris. I was talking about this a little bit earlier. I know we've been a little bit kind of back and forth on some of these things, so hopefully it's not too much rambling, but Pinot Gris is the same as Pinot Grigio. Yet here it's a very rich grape. It tends to be very focused on kind of like pear fruit flavors. There's a bit of citrus to it.
I want to ask you this, Kevin. Is Pinot Gris only Pinot Gris in Alsace, or are there other regions that call it Pinot Gris and not Pinot Grigio?
Good question. I mean, I've seen Pinot Gris from Oregon.
That's what I thought.
New World. I mean, they tend to not want to call it Pinot Grigio. Pinot Gris sounds a little bit more high end, I think.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with that.
Same grape, but there tends to be that. But I think if you're looking like in terms of old world wines, there's some great Pinot Grigios from Italy, but they're going to call it Pinot Grigio in Italy.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. That's the differentiator, right? Italian is going to be Pinot Grigio. French would be Pinot Gris.
Okay. Gris and Grigio are the same word, gray. It's the gray version of Pinot. So, the Pinot Gris is Grand Cru eligible as well. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's really interesting with Noble Rot when you can get a Pinot Gris that's a sweet wine, a dessert wine that can be really interesting. And it thrives in a lot of different soils there. So it's a fairly versatile grape for Alsatian winemakers. Gewürztraminer is another one that's a very significant grape. If anything, this is kind of an interesting trend that's emerging is to do a little bit more skin maceration with Gewürztraminer. So like orange wines, going that route with it. Not doing a sweet wine as much with Gewürztraminer as they used to do. Although I have to say that is my favorite version of Gewürztraminer is a sweet Gewürztraminer. It's just like a completely different thing.
I've never had it.
And I've never seen it here in America, only in Alsace.
Okay. I was going to say, I didn't even know it existed. Yeah.
This is why you got to go. It's to encounter those kinds of things. Because, Gewürztraminer has this real tropical fruit note, and it's said to be lychee. And I didn't really relate to that until I tasted a lychee, and I was like, oh, that is Gewürztraminer. It really tastes like that. And I think when it's dry, it tends to be very powerful, very forward. And as a result of that, it tends to be more of an acquired taste. You either love it or you don't. So it just depends on where you fall on that spectrum. But I mean, again, I by no means feel as though it's a grape that isn't capable of greatness. It's an acquired taste. It's a very specific taste.
I will tell you where I fall on that is I always love the nose, but I just don't enjoy the palate, the wine.
Yeah. And for me, I can enjoy a glass and I can't get past to a second glass.
Okay.
I'm tired. So, but again, there's my brother on the other hand, he's a big Gewürztraminer fan, loves it. It's a thing that just, it catches you. It's like it's the wine world's cilantro, put it that way.
Yeah.
So they have there's a few vineyards that really do well with Gewürztraminer. So it is also Grand Cru eligible. I mentioned Pinot Noir earlier being emergent. And then there's blended wines. So Cremant would be one of those. This would be a blend, traditional method sparkling wine. And we'll talk a little bit more about Cremant as we taste it, because I know we're getting kind of close to that kind of play where we talk about the wines we're tasting here. There's Edelsvicker, which is a white blend from all of the sanctioned white grapes in the area. That does not require a vintage. That's another one of those interesting grapes that you usually only get over there. It's kind of their fresh table wine, meant for kind of quick consumption and kind of parties. And then
is Pinot Blanc there?
There's a little bit of Pinot Blanc. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And it's
blending.
It's one of the kind of the central grapes in Cremant. And that's really kind of how they tend to plant it, and the purpose that they plant it for is to, use it for Cremant production for the most part. It tends to be the kind of the backbone of the Cremant wines. So you're not going to see as much varietal Pinot Blanc there. And then there's also field blends, where you have a mixed vineyard and everything's harvested at once and just fermented together. Marcel Dice is very famous for doing that approach. So there's a lot more than just Riesling and Pinot Gris when you scratch the surface.
What about styles? Because it's not as large as this area is. I think the exploration of this area is almost endless. That you're going to get so many different styles, either from the same producer or from obviously different producers as you go up and down the area of Alsace.
Yeah, I think for me the bigger thing is the vintage variation.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I think I've noticed that because I've been fortunate since I first went to Alsace with the Millésimes d'Alsace in 2018. I've been able to join their virtual programming that they've done through the pandemic, where they've sent wines out to do seminars and things like that. And so you can kind of check in on the vintage and everything. And I think you do see a little bit more variation from within a producer's portfolio that's kind of focused on the vintage and whether they were able to have a later harvest or whether it was a shorter harvest because conditions were so hot.
So let me ask you this, because when I ask the question, I'm thinking about other parts of the world where they make wine, and you might always hear somebody say, hey, pick up a stone, throw it, and 30 yards away or 50 yards away, the wines there can be completely different than what we're getting right here. Is Alsace not that way, or maybe it's potentially that way, but the winemakers have a profile that they try to achieve for consistency year in and year out?
Yeah, I think the winemaking methods are pretty straightforward to allow for that consistency. But I think the variable here is that soil that I was talking about, this matrix of geologic types that really makes broad strokes assumptions difficult, because you have, within one vineyard, you could go from one plot where it's limestone marl and move over and it's just pure limestone. Or some other sort of geologic variable like that would allow for so the producers even within their portfolio, they may have wines that just taste so totally different, and it's partly because they're sourcing from different parts of Alsace that are just drastically different geologically.
Okay, and I said style, and style wasn't the right word to describe that difference. It's more of just what.
Yeah, no, but I get what you mean.
What?
I mean, some regions I'm neck deep in Barolo and Barbaresco for my class on Sunday, but a long time in Barolo, the conversation was modernist versus tradition, right? Like the modernists would use oak barrique barrels, the traditionalists would use the large botis. The traditionalists would do long maceration, short maceration for the modernists. There's not really a stylistic divide so much like that within Alsace in terms of the winemaking. A lot of the white wines are made kind of the way white wines are made in stainless steel tanks. There is some use of large oak foeders, which is kind of a synonym for the Italian botti, the large oak cask. And sometimes that's reserved for like a Grand Cru vineyard. But to me, those variables aren't as noticeable to us as tasters, because the shift in vessel occurs at that Grand Cru level, and so what you're actually tasting too is the Grand Cru level fruit.
Okay.
So. Yeah, well, should we dive into tasting these wines?
That's what I was going to say. Can you walk me through and
Sure.
We'll taste these? You can kind of talk us through what we should be getting, or
the first. So for those watching this is our first wine here, which is Charles Fry's Cremant d'Alsace Brut Nature. So this is a non-dosaged traditional method sparkling wine. I was trying to find how long this spent on the lees. I think the minimum requirements in Alsace is 9 months. So not a huge amount of time. But I will say that there are some Cremant wines from Alsace that I think rival anything from Champagne. And I'm dead serious about that. One that I'm really fond of is Albert Boxler's Cremant d'Alsace. That is a killer wine, and it's cheaper than most Champagne. It's just a great go-to. So if you're thinking about New Year's Eve coming up, Cremant d'Alsace should be a candidate. I mean, you can do very well here for the price. These wines are very modestly priced, and the quality is very high. So Charles Fry is based in a little town called Dambach-la-Ville, which I actually visited. Dambach-la-Ville is interesting because there's like an organization of winemakers there who every year get together and they taste everyone's wine for the different classifications for their Grand Cru vineyard. And they blind taste it, and whoever has the best wine, as voted by their peers, they do a special bottling of that then gets cellared within the town cellar. And so it's really kind of interesting to kind of go into that town cellar and see all their old Rieslings and old Pinot Gris. And it's all from the different producers around the village. just based on having this blind tasting every year. And Charles Fry's in that village. This is one of the first biodynamic producers in Alsace. And so this Cremant's mainly made from Pinot Blanc. There's another grape here that we haven't talked about, which is Auxerrois, which is just kind of usually used for blending purposes in Alsace, and then quite a bit of Riesling. I don't know. What do you think of the wine?
You can tell it spent some time on the lees. I get a little bit of that bready kind of hint there as well.
Yep, that's catnip for me. I smell that, and I'm
really.
Yep, you got me. I love it. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if that was a good or bad thing for you, but yeah, it's a beautiful thing for me.
Yeah, for me.
I did want to just throw it out. You mentioned how good this wine is and that it's a good value. The suggested retail on this bottle, $22. And to your point, when you start talking about champagne and maybe 2 or 3 bottles because you're doing a celebration like New Year's Eve coming up,
or a wedding,
great value. Right?
Yeah. You want a nice high quality wine for a wedding toast, and you've got 200 guests. That 22 bottle of wine is going to get you really far.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that's almost criminally low in terms of the labor that goes into making this wine. Traditional method sparkling wines they're very labor intensive, and you have to be very precise with them. This is kind of one of the real secrets of French wine. If you're looking for a go-to introduction to sparkling wine, you could go with champagne, and I love champagne. Who doesn't? But Alsace, I think, is a little bit more accessible, and these wines tend to be, I think, because that Riesling is in there, you tend to have a little bit more of like a base note to the wine.
Can I tell you, I was a little bit nervous about tasting this for one reason, because there is no dosage. And I sometimes get a little nervous, to balance out the wine. That dosage sometimes I think is necessary. I think sometimes it's missed if you try a champagne that doesn't have it.
Yeah.
This works so well. I mean, if you told me this, if I just tasted it and you told me it didn't have a dosage, I would be a little surprised because it's very well balanced.
Well, you think about why you need dosage. It's in a place like Champagne where you're really far north. It's really cold. You're really struggling to achieve ripeness. It's out of necessity for balance. You're absolutely right about that. And you think about the climate in Alsace, it's not that climate. It's warmer, it's sunnier, and you're working with different grapes. So it's just not necessarily called for. So you do see a little bit more of the zero dosage movement kind of in the Cremant to Alsace that I've seen, at least. It's a good point.
Yeah. Very good wine. I'm impressed with this very much.
Yeah.
I'll be looking for more bottles of this.
And it's incredible too that so many of these producers make Cremant. Because it's really like, being a switch hitter. I mean, it's a whole other discipline to go in there and make traditional method sparkling wine, do it. You got to have the facilities to do it. You got to have the space. You got to have the time. And you got to have the vineyards that will support it. And, I would not be surprised if there were, if I was starting out in Alsace with a winery, that I would just say, boy, one thing at a time, I'm not going to go into Cremant yet. But invariably, so many of these producers have great Cremants in their repertoire. It's really quite amazing.
I mean, great acidity, a really good length on this wine as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the acidity is just really good for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's got a little bit of richness to it, too, from that Riesling, I think.
Agree.
Yeah. So, all right. Wine number 2 that we have. This is from 2021. It's from Henry Fuchs, and there's a nice little fox on the label. This is from the Fuchs family in Ribeauvillé, which is a beautiful village in Alsace, just near Colmar. As you're kind of heading north out of Colmar, you go by these spectacular villages. There's Ricvier, there's Hunevier, and then there's Ribeauvillé. It's really very memorable, the landscape, and the chapel at Hunevier is kind of one of the icons of Alsace. If you Google Alsace and look at images, it's probably going to pull up the chapel at Hunevier with these beautiful vineyards and just this really kind of signature look to it. So this wine comes from that area. I was trying to get some information on the soil types that this comes from. I believe it's from marl limestone. So, you think of marl limestone, that's kind of like a clay mixture with limestone. You're going to get really good acidity. Typically, you're going to get a lot of movement on the palate, and it's going to be paired with a little bit of power. That's going to be kind of coming from that marly soil. That tends to be kind of the profile that you have with it. This is a small certified organic family. Again, one of those producers that's all in on kind of the green approach in the vineyard. It's kind of got that classic Pinot Gris note, I think, on the nose. It's a little bit kind of
What
pears.
is that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean the fruit's a little bit. It's not appley to me. It's a little bit more. It just makes me think of like the kind of like on a ripe pear when the skin's kind of turning a little brown.
Okay.
It's kind of got that aroma to it.
I was going to say stewed pear, slightly stewed pear, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's a little herbal too. I think Pinot Gris at its best has a little bit of like an herbal note to it that makes you want to cook something. And I think there's just kind of this nice. There's almost like a little bit of a rose aroma to it, but it's not overpowering. Gewürztraminer has a very overpowering rose note to it. That's like one of the other parts of that whole Gewürztraminer profile. And, this Pinot Gris, it's just a very nice little subtle kind of rose hip kind of note to it, which I think is kind of nice.
The mouthfeel to me too on this one is a little bit more, it's got some body to it. It's got a little bit of weight to it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing you notice when you compare it to Pinot Grigio from Italy, right? At least the standard Pinot Grigio, the ones from the Veneto and from Trentino and those areas. I do think Pinot Grigio from Friuli, that's another ball game. Pinot Grigio from Alto Adige, that's another ball game. And I think that's a little bit more of a readily comparison. Oregon Pinot Gris, Alto Adige, Friuli Pinot Grigio, and Alsace Pinot Gris. Those are all really fun to compare. It'd be really fun to do a vertical tasting of those, or rather a horizontal tasting of those with some friends, because I think there's some subtle differences in the terroir. This one feels very typical of the Alsatian Pinot Gris. I'm glad they sent this one to us because I think it's a good ambassador for the style. You have that kind of rich feel on the palate, but then the finish is featherweight. It doesn't stick around and hang around like you're kind of feeling heavy and you can't have a second glass of it. So it gives you just enough of that body that, something you can kind of hold on to as you're tasting it. And then it just kind of goes its way.
Yeah. To me, this is a very nice wine that on the palate, to your point, you enjoy, but you're not really thinking about it, right? This is something with friends on the back porch on a summer day, or, you can just enjoy the wine, have a nice glass of wine and just enjoy the company that you're with.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about the finish of it now and, what to cook with it. Cause I know you're also got a lot of podcasts about cooking and living the good life and cuisines and things. What would you cook with this? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
I'm going to take your advice on what I should cook with this. What should I cook with this?
No, you're throwing it back at me.
Yeah.
I mean, we do, it's not very original, but we do a lot of pork tenderloin with like rosemary on it.
Okay.
I just think, something like that with maybe some like a fruit compote or something like that. So, but I don't know. It's again, for me, food pairing and talking about, what wines pair with what, it's really about versatility. How many different things could you throw at this wine and it would still display well? It wouldn't get overwhelmed. It would support the cuisine. And I think because of that acidity that the Alsatian Pinot Gris tends to have, and because it has all these other things peripheral to that's happening, it tends to be a pretty versatile wine that you can really do well with.
Yeah, I'm enjoying this one very much. And for those that are listening and watching, I've never had any of these wines. So this is my first time experiencing these. And,
cool.
Very, very good. I'm
from
impressed.
These producers or from this, like an Alsatian Pinot Gris?
I've had an Alsatian Pinot Gris, but never from these producers.
Yeah.
I've never had a Cremant from the area. So I was super impressed with that. And I'll be honest, Cremant's been something I've been exploring more because I've been trying to find some. My wife and I, on the first few that we tried, it was more of a miss. Yeah. The last couple we had one last night actually, and it was a big hit. And this one absolutely is a big hit. So
where was that Cremant from? Was it Cremant de Bourgogne or?
Yeah, it was Bourgogne.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't like talking in generalities if I can avoid it, but I tend to think that Alsace has got the best of the Cremants. The Cremant de Loire, Cremant de Limoux, from Burgundy as well. It just has a better batting average for me. I just think they're more interesting. And that price. I mean, the fact that they're priced what they are is it's a really good go-to sparkling wine if you want to stock your fridge with a lot of sparkling wine for New Year's. So.
Well, yeah, New Year's or just to have in the cellar when you want to enjoy a sparkling, because
of course,
delicious wine. I'm going to be seeking this one out for sure.
Nice, great. Well,
our last one. This is a
Grand Cru. Yeah,
I was going to say this is a special pour right here.
So I'm going to include some photos of this vineyard because I walked through this vineyard with Felix Meyer, the winemaker, in 2018. And I was there in June when there was this torrential downpour overnight. And as we walked into this vineyard, and this vineyard is called Vinnick Schlossberg. So this is the Grand Cru Vinnick Schlossberg. This is a Riesling from Meyer Fone, one of many Grand Cru vineyards that he works with. However, this is kind of the most important one to him because it's his backyard. So his winery is right there in the town of Katzenthal, and the Vinnick Schlossberg rises very steeply up. And this is a vineyard that has a great deal of granite with a lot of mica in it. And so the story behind it is that when the spring sun starts to hit the vineyards, it warms up very quickly. There's a radiant heat quality to the soil here that plays into the terroir and the behavior of the vines. But as a result of it, it's very crumbly. And so it's a very loose soil. And he was pointing out this new vine planting where they had, planted, baby vines and everything. And as a result of that, they did have to, remove a lot of the weeds, the cover crop that would normally provide cover. That's too much competition for young vines. So in this case, they want the vines to mature, to grow. So they denuded a lot of the grasses and weeds there. And the rain the night before had washed all of that topsoil away. It was just like at the bottom of the hill. It had just swept right through there. So the labor and the toil here with a new vineyard like that is they got to get the soil back up into, to cover up the vine rows where the young vines are. Once they reach a certain level that the vines are more mature and the roots are bigger, they don't have as much competition. They can then go that organic biodynamic route. You'll have poppies and flowers and herbs and grasses and weeds and stuff growing in the vines, and everything's chugging along just great. And so we climbed up into those vines as well, but it's incredibly steep. A lot of these Alsatian vineyards are, they're calf busters, and this would qualify. And on top of that, there's also, for me, and this is what, I'll always remember with this because I got great photos in this vineyard. There's this very photogenic castle parked right in the middle of it, the Vinnick Castle. It's this little fortification that's on the hill, and it just kind of adds to the scenery in a really profound way that makes it very memorable. So this is a Grand Cru Riesling that we're tasting, and it comes from that vineyard. So again, we're talking about drainage. You're thinking of a granite wine. You're thinking it might have the potential for minerality, that weird tone that we use, that we talk about in wine speak when we're talking about, a wine that kind of makes you think of stones, makes you think of maybe a rainstorm after on a hot day. It makes you think of the ocean. It makes you think of salt. And I'm curious to see if this wine displays that to me. I haven't really tasted it just yet to see if it does. I think for me, it's more predicated on the acidity. This is a very rich wine.
That's what I was going to say. That was my first
minerality, yeah. And I think that's something that, sometimes that's where the soil speak can get a little bit out of hand, is that you kind of dupe yourself into thinking that something's going to happen. But I do think this wine's got kind of this momentous wave of acidity that just, it's like it's on a train across your palate, but certainly a rich wine, real interesting details to it. What do you think?
That's what stood out to me right away was the richness of the wine. I mean, where does that come from on a wine like this that is so rounded like it is? The mouthfeel is just full body like it is.
Yeah, a lot of that's the variety of Riesling. Riesling's got this incredible grape skin. In fact, this is a photograph I have here it's behind my office every day of a Riesling grape. It's slightly desaturated, the photo is, but it's one of those grape varieties that, when you see it on the vine in the vineyard and you're looking at it, it's so multidimensional. There's like the skin has so much, variance and color to it. There's a lot of compounds in Riesling skin that make it the type of wine that it is. It can't help but be, that identity. It's kind of the beauty of Riesling.
And the other thing I wanted to have you talk about on this one, and I think I know the answer, but the alcohol, 13.5 on this.
Yeah. I mean, Riesling can be, I think we think of Riesling, 8-9%, but those are the sweet German ones, the cheaper bottles, right? This is very normal for Alsatian Riesling, is that level of alcohol. It ripens up there. Germanic Rieslings that are dry, they tend to be kind of that 12.5 from what I've seen. Yeah, this is definitely one of the hallmarks of Alsace is that you have a bit of a stronger wine. It's a little bit more muscular in its presentation and how it feels on the palate.
Well, and that's one thing I just wanted to mention, because for people that, you spoke about it earlier, that they just have this perception of Riesling and that all of them are somewhat sweet to whatever level. A tip to be able to get an idea of the sweetness level is the alcohol, being able to look at the bottle, and the higher the alcohol, potentially, it's going to be a drier wine than the lower alcohol Rieslings.
Yes. Yeah. And, they've made efforts in Alsace to add labeling that indicates dry versus sweet. They don't want to scream it on the label. So they've come up with a numeric code that they use that you can also look for. I wonder if it's on this one or not. Yeah, actually, here we go. It's on the side. Indice 2. So this is a number 2. So this is actually not a fully dry Riesling. It does seem to have a little bit of that kind of residual sugar to it. It is not fully sweet. It's just like a little hint. But because it's got that great line of acidity, you don't mind it, right? I think the issue with sweet wines is that they just kind of fall flat like a deflated tire on your tongue. Like it's just kind of, they don't go anywhere, right? And then you're exhausted and then you're just kind of like, you just need some water.
Yeah.
So with when you have a properly balanced wine that has a touch of sugar to it, that acidity really has to work extra hard. But yeah, the scale goes 1 through 5. 5 would be really sweet. 1 would be dry. You can always look for that on these labels. I'm curious if the Pinot Gris has that. Not everybody does it. It's voluntary. It doesn't look like there's anything on the Henry Fuchs Pinot Gris that marks that indication. But yeah, again, the alcohol's a good indicator, and then you can look for that 1 through 5 if they have it.
And I'll tell you, you just mentioned the Pinot Gris. I never knew there would be residual sugar in some of these Pinot Gris. Is that just in Alsace, or when we talk about Pinot Grigio, is there residual sugar, and Pinot Gris from Oregon? Is that something?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the really lower market, Pinot Grigios, there's the possibility that they could have some residual sugar to them, or just add sugar to them, or there might be some additives to it. But I mean, I wouldn't get too hung up on residual sugar in the Pinot Gris. I think most of them are dry. And especially the ones that, we were talking about from Friuli and Alto Adige, they've been determined to make dry Pinot Grigio, for generations. So it's really been driving in that style. In Alsace, they've kind of flirted with going back to sweeter wines 20 years ago. And so when I was there in 2018, a lot of the, producers were talking about going back towards dry wines. And it was, as someone who's a newcomer to Alsace, I was like, what, you mean you weren't making them dry? Like, why would you do that? So it is something that is part of the variety that's to Alsace. Is you do get some that have a little bit of sugar.
Yeah, I just didn't know if that was a common thing in Pinot Gris, or if that was just something
in Pinot Gris. Not as much. The one that I mentioned was Domaine Zindhumbruck. That's an outlier. I mean, that's the Longue de Tan, where you've got Noble Rot, and Noble Rot is often seen as kind of this gift from above, for a winemaker. And I saw it in Sicily, of all places, where there was a producer named Gorgi Tondi, and they have a vineyard of Grillo growing right by the Sicilian Strait, and they have 6 or 7 rows that are depressed like this. It's just a little trough, but they have vine rows there, and it's enough of a geologic or geographic feature that sea air comes into the vineyard, and that those 6 rows get Noble Rot. The other rows do not. And they just were like, thank you. So they made a separate sweet wine just because they wanted to have, it's like, you want to know what Grillo tastes like with Noble Rot. So when you have the conditions that allow for it, you kind of want to let it go that route to see what kind of dimensions you get, because you get so many different flavors and complexity, and it really creates kind of this timeless wine that's really interesting to see. So, I mentioned that earlier. I think for the most part, though, Pinot Gris, it's going to be dry.
Okay. Yeah. People hear you mentioned this Noble Rot, and you definitely cleared it up. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing.
It is a good thing. And it'll be noted on the, label as Selection Grand Noble. So that'll let you know that it's actually a Noble Rot wine. But again, we're really only talking about a small percentage, and they're really they might even be. I mean, that wine in particular might even be allocated. It's in such small supply. If it's going to be coming to our market, you can kind of bet that the importers are going to make sure that it's a dry wine because they want to sell it. Yeah. And that's what our market probably is going to be wanting.
Well, I hope our market gets back into, I don't know if back into is the right way to say it, but gets into or discovers sweet wines, because I have over the last couple of years, and man, I absolutely love sweet wines. I didn't know Alsace had some. Are there some that are distributed here into the States?
Very few. Very few.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough
unfortunate
sell. You know, it's a tough sell. But I think when you're there, if you visit, you'll find them. You'll find them in wine shops. You'll find them at wineries that you visit. You'll find them at restaurants. And I highly encourage that experience. I mean, especially if you're listening to this podcast because you're planning a trip to Alsace and you want the down low on the wines. That's a sensational experience because it's just so different. You know, we don't get that sort of experience here in the United States, and we don't have a culture of sweet wines. We don't have a culture of dessert wines. For me, it's December right now that we're recording this, and we just had Thanksgiving, and I celebrate Christmas, and those are two holidays for me that I love having a sweet wine instead of dessert. You know, give that to me instead of pumpkin pie.
Absolutely,
that's my dessert. I'm totally fine with it. So. Yeah.
Well, let's close out the episode by you giving, if you don't mind, I'm putting you on the spot here, Kevin.
Okay.
But 3, 4, maybe 5, whatever you want to come up with, places to go, things to do, things about Alsace that, to your point, you just mentioned, if you're listening to this, watching this because you're planning a trip to Alsace, what would be some things that people need to make sure they write down and put on their list of, don't miss this?
Well, I would say, for one, take your time. I think the temptation with a place like this that's this large, you kind of want to set, a lot of different appointments with wineries and cram your schedule.
Here, I'm going to ask you a question then to that point. I hate to interrupt. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
But should this be the destination, not one of the stops in our trip? Is Alsace a place that you need to spend 6, 7, 8 days to explore and enjoy?
Well, it depends on your travel style. I mean, I'm kind of getting to a point where I like just doing deep dives, So like for me, I'm happy going to one place, checking into one hotel, and that's it. Not moving my bags around and just getting to know the place and then coming home. But at the same time, it's, if it's a once in a lifetime trip to France, you've never been to France before, then I would highly recommend, going down to Burgundy or then going over to Champagne. I spent some time in Beaujolais this summer, which is a beautiful region, rivals Alsace in terms of scenic beauty. Those are fun places to explore if you're into wine, for sure.
Okay.
I think with Alsace, Colmar is a nice natural home base, because what you get in Colmar is the charm of this intimate little city with its half timbered houses, and you get a lot of different restaurants you can choose from, so that's nice at night. And then you're within close shot of several of these villages. I mentioned Ribouvelet, I mentioned Hunevere and Ricvier. Turkheim is another nice one. There's the Grand Cru Brand right above Turkheim. That's a great Riesling vineyard. And Brand's a fun town to visit. I would say that if you're going to visit some of these wineries, you absolutely need to have an appointment. You definitely need to give them a heads up, especially a month ahead of time. And you have to remember too, these are small family wineries. They're all doing a lot of work, all on their own. And sometimes of the year, they may not accept visitors. And it's not because they're being rude. It's because they just have work to do. So harvest time can be a little bit of a tricky time to get appointments. So you probably want to, if it's early summer, that's a good time to visit. But definitely make sure that they're okay accepting visitors. Ask, do they charge a fee for it? Do they expect you to buy wines? Get all the terms kind of figured out ahead of time. And then just enjoy yourself. I mean, Alsatian people are very warm, very hospitable. And, it helps to know some French for sure. If you could, do a little Duolingo ahead of time to get the basics. But I think that, Colmar is definitely worth seeing and spending a little bit of time touring. You can kind of head out in any which direction to see some of these villages and really enjoy yourself. And also, if you're an outdoorsy type, you can do some hiking, I believe, in the Vosges Mountains. That gives you a little bit of fresh air. I always like to balance, all this wine drinking and eating with a little bit of physical exertion. So, not a bad thing.
And you mentioned cycling earlier.
Yeah, cycling. Exactly. The roads are, 2-lane roads. So, ride at your own risk. But, and then the city of Strasbourg, I've heard good things about. I've not actually spent a lot of time there other than just doing a train transfer. But I do know a lot of people are really fond of Strasbourg as a destination. So, you can do that. Another approach is to mix it with Germany. I mean, Germany is right there, and there's some really interesting wine regions. You're real close to the Black Forest. So, if you're doing a European holiday over there, it doesn't have to be only focused on France. You could mix it in a little bit with Germany, or run down to Switzerland and see, little bits and pieces of that. So, yeah.
I think that's a great tip. Yeah.
Yeah. And along the way, ask what they don't export and buy it.
Yeah, no,
because a lot of them are more profound and interesting wines. It doesn't mean they're the best wines, but they're certainly the ones that will make you the most curious. Are these ones that they're keeping to themselves? So
yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Rob.
And doing the episode. Man, I know I learned a lot, so I'm absolutely positive the listeners are and the viewers are listening and watching and getting some great information as well. Yeah,
I hope they enjoy it. So. Great to chat with you as always, and enjoy these wines with whatever you cook them with tonight.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Food, Wine, and Whiskey. And until our next episode, enjoy your next pour.